Welcome back. This is the last installment of my description of the FUTR model, a unique model that can help you make better decisions by thinking about the facts, the unknowns, the theories, and now in this section, the risks. Let's begin by thinking about and defining risk. As we turn to our good friend, the Oxford English Dictionary, we find this interesting definition of risk: the error of an observation or result without regard to sign. I like this definition because when you think traditionally about risk, and many of my friends who work in risk management, they think about risk as the threat of peril or harm. They think of the downside risk, the error of an observation or a result that could be negative. But what the Oxford English Dictionary does is brings us much closer to a finance definition and notion of risk, where we're thinking about without regard to sign. We're thinking about upside volatility as well as downside volatility. So as we go on to talk about risk, I want you to think about volatility, which could have a tremendous upside as well as a tremendous downside. So the final category in the FUTR model, and on the back of the envelope, that fourth column, is all about risks. And let me provide you with 6 questions that will help you think systematically about the risks of the decisions that you face. And you might want to keep in mind throughout this presentation, we've talked about the decision about where to live for your first job. And the question is, what are the schools like in the areas that we're considering living? And let's presume that that's an important question for you. So the first question to ask is a question about the world itself. Is there a risk-free world? Now, this is a yes or no question, and it's actually quite simple. The answer is no. There is no risk-free world. And you might think that's a pretty trivial way to start a discussion about risk, is by such an obvious question. But I pose it, and I think it's important because there are so many of us who believe that there is a risk-free decision, that if we work hard enough, if we're clever enough, if we're forward-thinking enough, we can find a solution that has no downside and is filled with only upside. Or we can find one where there's no upside beyond what we could imagine. And what we all know is that just isn't the case. The world is in fact risky. There is volatility, there is uncertainty, and you deny it at your own peril. The second question is a question about you. And the question is, how do I perceive risk? Is risk a good thing or is risk a bad thing? Risk is a bad thing if it makes you want to run and hide under your bed and pull up the covers and just not deal with potential volatility because it just makes you uneasy and squeamish. Your attitude toward risk is good if you say, well, let's square up and let's face the risks, let's analyze them, let's figure out which risks we can transfer, which ones we might be able to mitigate or control, and which ones we simply have to accept or absorb. So the second question is your attitude toward risk. And if you are afraid of risk, it will tend to make you a poor decision maker because you'll fail to take into account this nasty, pesky fourth column of things that might go wrong. So think about, is there a risk-free world where all the schools are good? No. How is my attitude toward risk? If I'm afraid of risk, what I might do is think, well, I really can't know about the quality of the school district, so I'm just going to throw up my hands and hope for the best. That's a pretty poor attitude toward risk and toward your children's education. Instead, a much better attitude is, we've got some theories, we have some evidence, we're pretty sure that the school is good, but what are the risks involved? What if it turns out dramatically better than we think? What if it turns out dramatically worse? So question number 1 is about the world. Question number 2 is about you. Question number 3 is about the structure of the volatility itself. One of the things that you learn from your finance class is if you're going to take high risk, or be willing to take on extreme volatility, the reward better be worth it. And so there is what's known as the risk-reward trade-off. And it's important to use this same paradigm in your personal and professional decision making. When you're thinking about a decision that has a high level of volatility, the question is there enough potential upside or a certain enough potential upside or a probable enough potential upside that it's actually worth engaging in? Is the reward worth the risk? And let me give you an example of a behavior that I've seen people engage in that is a very poor calculation of risk and reward. And that's people who commit adultery and cheat on their spouse or partner. The reason why this is such a poor payoff is because there's tremendous downside risk in terms of the carnage that it causes in relationships that spread outward from the individual and those directly involved and affect many, many others. And what's the payoff? Usually some kind of just short-term hedonic pleasure, and you're willing to literally throw away so much that you've worked for a very short-term payoff. So that's an example of people who don't do the risk-reward trade-off very well. And I would encourage you to not make that mistake, but to ask yourself, what's the payoff? Question number 4, what are or where are the black swans? Now, The Black Swan is the title of Nassim Taleb's famous book, which, as I've said before, is a great read, whether or not you're a finance professional, because it gives you some insight into how to think about risks. And Taleb talks about being invited to attend a risk management conference in Las Vegas. At first, he chuckled because he thought that all the risks of gambling are perfectly known. What can this risk management conference say to me that's of any value? But he decided to go because he wanted a free weekend in Vegas. He said when he got there, the owner of the hotel in the session stood up and said, "Let me tell you about the 4 biggest risk events that our hotel has experienced. Event number 1, we lost $100 million a year when the tiger ate the entertainer. This was the hotel that had employed Siegfried and Roy, the famous tiger and lion trainers who put on a spectacular animal show, but they had never anticipated and never bothered to insure against the eventuality that the tiger would maul one of the entertainers, wiping out the act and leaving that revenue stream completely bereft and completely at risk." So that was the first big loss event. And Taleb was pretty interested because that's a black swan. Number 2, the hotel lost something like $20 million in an IRS fine because it turns out that a low-level accounting employee who had been required to submit a form every month, something showing compliance with the hotel with IRS regulations, had failed to do so for a period of over 2 years. And so the hotel was hit with a massive fine. Another black swan event, a small organizational risk that was allowed to fester and not be controlled, that turned out to be a huge loss event. The third loss event was when a disgruntled contractor, someone who had worked on the hotel and had been very dissatisfied with the terms of payment or the agreement, tried to blow up the parking garage and caused severe damage that the hotel then had to repair. Now that's a pure black swan event. Very low probability, very high impact. And the fourth and final loss event for the hotel was once one of the owner's daughters was kidnapped, and the hotel had to, while breaking the law, dip into hotel profits and casino profits to pay the ransom money. So Taleb left the conference realizing that there were in fact black swans in the casino industry. So when you're thinking about black swans, these aren't the unknowable risks. These aren't the unthinkable things. These are the low probability, high impact events that's so easy to overlook because their probability is so low. So as you're evaluating risk, ask yourself, where are the black swans? And take some time figuring this out. Question number 5, what's the term of the risk? Is the risk that we're taking on short-term risk or long-term risk? When you came back to get your MBA, a lot of people probably asked you, why are you giving up a great job, potential for advancement, to go get a degree? You're giving up a lot that you could have right now a lot of comfort and pleasure for something far into the future. And you probably responded with something like this. I'm doing it because I believe that by sacrificing now and getting an education, I'll actually be much better off in the long term. I'll enjoy greater job autonomy. I'll enjoy greater job flexibility. I'll enjoy greater compensation. And I'll probably have a happier and more interesting life. So, what you, in essence, answered is, I'm willing to accept short-term risk and short-term volatility because I believe that the long-term play that I'm making here will make me put me in a less risky situation. And so I'm buying short-term risk to buy down long-term risk. Now think about the other side of that coin, where you simply choose to avoid short-term risk in the hope that because you don't want to absorb it and it's too painful, but you in fact incur much longer term risk because of your decision. So think about the term of the risk. What's the relationship between short-term and long-term risk in this decision? And finally, number 6, are there hedges available? Are there ways that I can control potential downsides or limit the volatility that's involved in the overall decision by somehow buying or enacting some kind of hedge? Now, this is difficult to think of particular examples, but it's worth thinking about, are there ways that I can hedge my bet to make sure that I don't completely expose myself to all of the volatility? So, for example, can I move to a city where if the school district turns out to be not that great, I can enroll my child in a charter school, or there's a public charter school system, so at very low cost, we can move schools if things don't work out. That's a way of thinking about hedges. So there you have it, the future model, laid out in all of its glory. Facts about the decision, about me, unknowns about the decision and about me, culled based on the basis of their centrality to your life's mission and to the urgency with which you need to know them. Theories and 4 critical questions. Karl Popper's question, the croupier's question, Dick McCann's question, and the option to sit in someone else's chair. And finally, in this segment, we've talked about risks. Is there a risk-free world? The answer is no. What's my attitude toward risk? Is risk a good thing or a bad thing? What's the payoff? Is the reward worth the volatility? Where are the potential black swans? Am I trading short-term risk for long-term risk? Or what is the nature of that trade? And finally, are there ways that I can hedge my bets? In conclusion, let me just say again, the future model is not a function machine. You don't put a problem in at the beginning, and by the end of thinking through hedges, the decision presents itself in miraculous form. It's a clarifying tool that helps you understand the key issues, that helps you understand your key values, how you think about the future, and how you can anticipate and solve for risk. As you begin to make better decisions, I wish you the best of luck, and will tell you that the future model is a powerful way to help you do that. Thank you.